Hey guys, in this video we'll be comparing these fast Fuji prime lenses to their f2 equivalents. In Fuji land, whenever one of us reviewers focuses on any of the Fuji prime lenses, say the 23mm 1.4 for instance, we get a lot of people in the comments saying that the f2 version is better for various reasons. It seems that where Fuji has several focal lengths with both fast aperture variety and an f2 variety, this sort of discussion is prone to come up, and it's always caused me some self-doubt in regards to my own buying decisions. Did I make the right decision? Should I purchase the 35mm 1.4 instead of the 35mm f2 for instance? Is my 56 1.2 really all that much slower in focus compared to the 50mm f2? Well, today I'm going to find out. But before we dive into things, I do want to take a second to thank Fuji Pro Rentals for hooking me up with a few of the lenses that I don't own to make this video possible. Check them out for all your Fuji rental needs. You can find a link to them below. So in front of me we have 6 prime lenses. On this side we have the fast aperture versions, the 35mm 1.4, the 23mm 1.4, and the 56mm 1.2. And over on this side, we have the f2 versions in equivalent or near equivalent focal lengths. The 23mm f2, the 35mm f2, and the 50mm f2. And the question I want to answer in this video is which of these lenses at the various equivalents or near equivalencies is better? Now, better can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but maybe a different way to phrase that is to say, what am I going to give up, if anything, by spending less money on one of these cheaper f2 lenses than one of their more expensive older brothers? So first, let's compare the obvious stuff. We'll start with price. The prices are in US dollars as of October 2018. And as you can see, you'll be saving quite a bit if you can make those f2 lenses work for your photography. Next, let's look at weight and size. No big surprise here other than the 35-1.4, which sort of breaks the pattern. In most cases, the fast prime version is almost twice the weight as the f2 version, but the 35-1.4 is only slightly heavier than its f2 brother. Now, in my years of making Fuji videos and hearing people talk about Fuji lenses, there's a very common theme among the owners of the f2 variety of the lenses, and that's that they often claim that the f2 is a lot faster at focusing. Now, okay, maybe that's true, but is it really so much faster that it's going to make a difference in most real-life photography situations? There, I'll admit I was a little bit skeptical, so let's go ahead and find out. To test focusing speeds, I just filmed the back of the screen as I acquired focus on consistent points for all lenses. Since this footage was shot before the X-T3 was released, my tests were limited to the X-T2. After gathering the footage, I pulled all this up on Premiere and just counted the number of frames it took to acquire focus. Since I tested in a variety of lighting situations and distances, I opted to show the percentage difference, as the actual milliseconds will vary depending on the context. But I did find that the focusing percentages between the pairs of lenses were fairly consistent. And on average, I found the 23mm 1.4 to be 70% slower than the 23mm f2. The 35mm 1.4 was 23% slower than the 35mm f2. And the 56mm 1.2 was nearly 80% slower than the 50mm f2. Many people cite sharpness as the reason to go with one version over the other, so I was eager to test the sharpness differences between these lenses. When we look at the 23mm lenses, comparing apples to apples at f2, I can't tell a difference in the center. It's only as we head out toward the edges that we can see very slight improvement of the 23 f2 over the 23 1.4, but I would call this a victory for the f2 by the slimmest of margins only. However, any advantage the f2 has disappeared after f4, where, surprisingly, the 23 1.4 appears to start to win the sharpness war, at least at the edges. Throughout the aperture range, I could find no perceivable difference in the lenses at the center. For the 35mm, I saw a bit more pronounced differences. Though at f2 they are both extremely sharp at the center, the 1.4 appears just a hair sharper. But as we head out towards the edges, we start to see differences, with the f2 clearly coming out ahead. But as we stop down, at f4 we see less of a difference, and by f8 it becomes almost indistinguishable. I always hear people claim that the 50mm is much sharper than the 56 1.2, but in these tests and comparing apples to apples at f2, I only see that the 50mm is sharper at the corners, and that's only true up until about f8. In the center though, I see the 56 1.2 being as sharp if not sharper than the 50mm f2. Next, let's see what sort of bokeliciousness we give up if we go with one of the f2 lenses as opposed to one of the faster primes. And for these tests, we'll be shooting all lenses at their maximum aperture. Let's first start with the 35mm lenses, where I see the least difference personally. Now, I'm not much of a bokeh connoisseur, but aside from the subtle cat's eye bokeh balls you get near the edges of both lenses, I feel like the autofocus areas of both lenses are creamy and pleasant, with the 35mm 1.4 producing just slightly more creaminess. The differences seem more pronounced with the 23mm lenses, with the f2 having much more solid looking shapes in the backgrounds, at least in these sample images. But as expected, where you see the biggest differences between the 56mm 1.2 and the 50mm f2. Here it's important to consider not only that the 1.2 is going to give you much more bokeh than the f2 lens at this focal length, but additionally that more narrow focal length will tend to create more fall off due to compression. It's not a fair quote-unquote comparison certainly, but again the purpose of this study is to see what you would realistically expect to give up if you were to choose the f2 rather than the faster prime. The only time I care about or notice vignetting is when I have a beautiful, clear, uninterrupted blue sky, as I often do in southern Utah, and in these cases I prefer to see a nice consistent blue. In other cases, I really couldn't care less about a little bit of vignetting, but just for the sake of the comparison, I did shoot all of these lenses wide open against a blue sky, and the results were fairly straightforward. All of these lenses show subtle vignetting when shot wide open. Of course, stopping down eliminates this in all cases, but there weren't really any of these lenses that stood out as particularly awful in this test. Last thing I want to consider is focusing noise. This will matter most if you want to be near silent at a wedding, or if you plan to use any of these lenses for video. But even for stills photographers, I have noticed a pattern of questions in the forum where someone will be excited to get one of these ultra fast primes and then be surprised by the terrible noise they produce when focusing. It's common to see them jump on the forums to ask other people if their lens is defective because it sounds so bad when it focuses. It's an issue I've seen repeated often enough that I felt it warranted discussion here and certainly comparison. People always complain about that 35mm 1.4 and its older autofocus technology. They say that it can sound defective. But in my testing, the loudest lens by far was the 56mm 1.2. With that stepping motor, you can hear that clunking and almost grinding around of all that heavy glass. 23mm 1.4 was better, but only by a bit. As expected, the f2 lenses with those linear motors are extremely quiet, with the 35mm f2 and the 23mm f2 being near silent. The 50mm f2 makes only a small electronic hum, sort of like a printer head moving around. Now, your mileage may vary here, but in general, I'd say it's safe to say that those f2 lenses are much more quiet than their fast prime siblings. All right, so now that I've shared with you my findings, as always, I encourage you to do your own research and compare my findings with what others have said. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into my own recommendations as well as what I personally plan to shoot with going forward. Guys, people in the comments almost always cite autofocus and sharpness as the two most important reasons why you might actually prefer the f2 variety of the lens over the respective fast prime sibling. But in my tests, the only lens combination where sharpness was a significant enough reason or difference for me to even care was possibly between the 35mm 1.4 and the 35mm f2. But the only time that will matter to you is if you're shooting wide open and for some reason you absolutely cannot compromise on sharpness edge to edge in the photo. Otherwise, honestly, all these lenses, they're extremely sharp, and any differences you'll see will be so imperceptible that I just don't think it should factor into a purchasing decision myself. As far as autofocus speeds, here again, I'd be very surprised if you'll be able to really see a difference between the tiny advantage that the f2 lenses provide. The only time it might matter to you is in action or sports, but these lenses aren't the lenses you use for action and sports. With that in mind, when it comes to the four wider primes, the 23s and the 35s, personally, I don't think you should factor in autofocus speed in the decision. I think the bigger determinant of which to buy will be weight and size, price, low light capability, and weather resistance. In the case of the 23mm, if you plan to go out into the elements a lot, you might consider the f2 for its weather resistance. If size matters to you and you want as light and small as possible, again, the f2. The f2 is slightly faster at focusing, but it's so small advantage, I really can't think of a time where the difference will matter enough to factor into a buying decision. Street photographers may think it will give them an advantage, but for us who like to zone focus, the 23mm 1.4 is actually really nice. It has the clutch manual focus ability and also those depth of field and distance markings. In fact, it's the only prime out of the 6 that has this. For wedding photography, I'm going to recommend the 1.4 version, as you'll want that slight low light advantage. But for most other types of photography, save a bit of money and get the f2 version. As for me, I am sticking with the 23-1.4 for the occasional weddings that we do. When it comes to the 35 35 millimeters, the size, weight, and cost of the 35-1.4 is actually a lot closer to the F2 version. The only real advantage I see of the 1.4 version is for low light shooting and slightly better subject isolation. But for me, I don't like that it's louder when it focuses and that it has that external focus movement. Again, the F2 version has the advantage of weather resistance, it's sharper towards the edge, wide open, and it has a tiny bit faster autofocus. And since I don't usually find myself in low light situations when I want that 50mm equivalent focal length, after all the analysis, the 35 f2 remains my favorite shoot-around lens, and I'll be sticking with it. But where autofocus might matter to you is when we reach for the 56mm 1.2 and the 50mm f2. The 50mm f2 focuses nearly twice as fast in most cases. Again, we are still talking about milliseconds here, and maybe that matters for the type of photography you're doing, but when it comes to these two lenses, I'll say that the 50mm does outperform the 56 in several areas. It's cheaper, it's lighter, it focuses faster, and in my mind, the only place that it loses out is in low light and in subject isolation. If you shoot a lot of weddings or in dark areas, that 1.2 is nice to have, but where it really shines is in portraiture. Shooting wide open provides the very soft bokeh that is the best that Fuji can offer. Having said that, is your client really going to be able to tell the differences between the bokeh of these two photos? I really doubt it. The only people this is truly going to matter to is you and your pixel peeping friends. So here's my recommendation. If the reason you need a good portrait lens is to photograph your kids or your pets, and you really geek out by bokeh and money is less of an issue, you'll probably be happier and more excited to shoot with 56 1.2. Also, if you're a wedding photographer who shoots Fuji, it really is a must for low light and a no compromise portrait lens. However, if you shoot portraits for a living and you're not often doing that in low light, I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and say you might be happier with the 50 f2 as it's cheaper, lighter, has snappier focus, and I actually think I prefer this guy in a studio. I really doubt your clients will miss the bokeh you're sacrificing, but aside from that, the only reason to spend the extra money on the 56 1.2 is vanity. As for me, I have to admit, I'm a little torn here. I've been super impressed with the little 50 f2, and it's made me rethink the 56 1.2 if that's really the portrait lens I want. So guys, those are my thoughts, but before we conclude, I will leave you with just a couple more things to consider. In 2019, Fuji is supposed to release two other interesting lenses, the 33mm f1 and the 16mm 2.8. So once I get my hands on those two lenses, I'm going to need to run some more comparisons, since I think that 33 f1 could really replace that outdated, in my mind, underperforming 35mm 1.4. And having another 16mm to compare against the really remarkable 16mm 1.4 will also be a very interesting test on the wide end. But until then, I really hope you found this video to be helpful. I wish you all the best in your buying decisions and your photography endeavors. Remember, kindness before cameras. We'll talk to you again real soon.